welcome Professor Hamid Dabashi, and I would like to thank him because we gave him a very short notice for this talk. So today, Professor Dabashi will talk about perils and promises of identity politics, Arabs and Americans in a time of Trump. So there are many factors that determined the outcome of the US elections. However, Trump succeeded in bringing out white working class voters in key area of the swing states. And those voters actually were thrilled to his talk of building walls along the US border, of keeping out Muslims, and generally restoring the societal hierarchies that prevailed half a century ago. And it was not some kind of a random accident that Trump was endorsed by the KKK, or Ku Klux Klan, which advocates the white nationalism, the white supremacy, and the anti-immigration laws. So I don't want to take much time introducing the topic because I'm very much looking forward to hearing Hamid talking about this. Please, the stage is yours. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm absolutely thrilled to be back on the I campus. It's a home away from home for me. And these days, with what's happening in the US, I'm very happy to be away from what Eid calls Trump's time. Eid has asked me to, the title that Eid and I came up with, as you know, Eid is very much into the identity, transnational identity and so forth, identity politics. So I put, for his sake, perils and promises. I'm not very fond of the notion of identity, as I will explain. Perils and promises of identity, and I will operate between those two, that tension. And then Arabs and Americans in time of Trump. Let me begin by, as I'm sure you could not have avoided the US presidential elections. Huge number of other important things were happening around the globe, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. In Colombia, a huge, almost 50-year war was coming to an end. The carnage in Yemen, the carnage in Syria, etc. But everything was under the hegemony of the news. And those of us who were reluctantly and inevitably following it, is it Clinton, is it Trump, is it Clinton, is it Trump, we're just hoping that by the end of this election cycle, one of them will get elected and the thing will be over. But inevitably, everybody was hoping, thinking, in fact, up until the last minute, all the polls were indicating that Clinton will win. Right before the Director Comey's latest intervention about the interminable issue of emails of Senator Clinton, all the indications were, and in fact, New York Times was giving 93% chance of winning to Hillary Clinton. After Director Comey's letter to the Congress, it came down to 85–86%. And up until the night of the election on the 8th of November, everybody thought that Clinton is going to win, and it was the matter of how big or small. Just to make sure, to put everything on the table, I was neither a fan of Clinton nor a fan of Trump, of course. And from the very beginning, much hope was invested, in fact, in the candidacy of Bernie Sanders. And next to Bernie Sanders was, of course, the Green Party movement, Jill Stein, that also was not carrying as much weight as Bernie Sanders, but nevertheless had some significant traction. Bernie Sanders was systematically sabotaged. Was sabotaged by DNC, by the Democratic National Convention. Some of the issues that were exposed during the WikiLeaks revelations Now, whether the Russians gave them, the Chinese gave them, or some fat guy, as they say, sitting on somewhere gave them, it's irrelevant. The fact is that there were indications that Debbie Schultzman, and as the head of the DNC, and Donna Brazile were actually helping systematically Hillary Clinton. Donna Brazile actually stole questions from CNN and gave them to Hillary Clinton in one of the debates with Bernie Sanders. And even the White House, Barack Obama was actively sabotaging Bernie Sanders' campaign and was forcing him to yield, and ultimately he yielded, and Clinton became the candidate for the Democratic. Now, those of us who were following Sanders, we made a strategic decision. You know that there are blue states, red states, and swing states in the United States. Blue states are solid Democratic states. No matter what they vote Democratic. For example, New York, where I live, is a blue state. 59 of the votes went to Clinton, which means she got all the electoral college. So those of us who were in blue states, we opted not to vote because none of these two were our candidates, but did not damage the chance of Hillary Clinton defeating Donald Trump. But those who were in swing states, Michigan, Ohio, Florida, and were supporters of Sanders, they decided to vote for Hillary Clinton against Trump in order not to, for Trump not to win. Now, after that comes the issue of how did Trump win? The narrative that I gave you is the dominant narrative, white working class. I have written against that category because that does two things, racializes and demonizes the working class, white working class. First of all, there is a variety of reasons why Trump won. It's not just one reason, okay? And tabulating, in no question that yes, his campaign was misogynistic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, against the Mexicans, against the Muslims, against women, etc., etc. This was his campaign. We have to make a distinction between his campaign and those who are now liberated and allowed, like the KKK, the alt-right, etc., and the actual demographic composition of people who voted for him. I make a similar distinction between the anti-Morsi demonstrations of June 30th in Egypt and the military coup of Sisi. These are two different phenomena. Yes, some of those who demonstrated against Morsi were hoping for a military coup, but the entirety of the demographic composition of the demonstrations were not, of course, for military coup. Now, right now in the United States, it is a huge condition of trauma, is a liberal trauma. The trauma is that they wanted Hillary Clinton to get elected. They have had the first African-American president. Then they would come the first woman president. And what Clinton would do in terms of her foreign policies in Syria, in Eastern Europe, or the rest of the world, they will say, oh, how horrible it is. But it was not of their concern. Their concern was to have a nice, liberal woman president and get this over. Now, the issue that now we face, that the question of identity politics comes into it, what is the assessment of the post-election that has happened? And how much of this post-electoral crisis is the crisis of liberal democracy coming to terms with the fact that concepts such as banana republic or third world dictatorship that they had invented for other countries. Banana republic was a category that they created for Latin America. Third world dictatorship was a concept that they created for the Arab world, the Islamic world, Eastern Europe, etc. And the worst elements, such as, for example, conflict of interest, the fact that you have a businessman who has business interests and has just appointed as his Secretary of State somebody who is the head of an oil company with Russia and is a close friend of Putin, as his chief diplomat. These are the issues that the liberal contingency of American politics is not very happy with. Now, then came what in the US we call Monday morning quarterbacking. So how did we lose? And here is the two major issues came soon after the election that I want to share with you, and that is the question of identity politics. On November 18th, Mark Layla, who is a colleague of mine at Columbia University, wrote a very influential essay, The End of Identity Liberalism. And in it, he argued as follows. In the first paragraph is a celebration of diversity in American society. It is a truism, he says, that America has become a more diverse country. It is also a beautiful thing to watch. Visitors from other countries, particularly, this is Mark Layla the date is very important, on the 17th of November. Visitors from other countries, particularly those having trouble incorporating different ethnic groups, he's thinking of European context, and faith, are amazed that we managed to pull it off. Not perfectly, of course, but certainly better than any European or Asian nation today. It is an extraordinary success story. Now, what is missing from that paragraph is, of course, the demography of American society. American society is much younger society than European societies. And as a result, incorporation of labor migration from Latin America or other places is not that much of a big issue. They need cheap labor. They keep the cheap labor illegal, so they cannot unionize, they cannot mobilize, etc. This is different from European context, that the population is getting increasingly older. As a result, the younger labor, they need the laborer. They need the labor, but they don't like the laborer. So they ban, for example, menorah and, of a mosque. Now, here comes the gist of Mark Layla's argument. But how should this diversity shape our politics? The standard liberal answer for nearly a generation now has been that we should become aware of and celebrate our differences. Which is a splendid principle of moral pedagogy, but a disaster as a foundation for democratic politics in our ideological age. In recent years, American liberalism has slipped into a kind of moral panic about racial, gender, and sexual identity that has distorted liberalism's message and prevented it from becoming a unifying force capable of governing. The rest of the essay, which I recommend for you to read, is a critique of Hillary Clinton's campaign, that Hillary Clinton campaign catered too much to Mexicans and women and Muslims and etc. That is, Hillary Clinton was waiting for Trump to say something about Muslims, then she would come and say, oh no, we're Muslim. I mean, their policies, of course, were not that different. Trump would say, we need a Muslim registry or extreme vetting for Muslims. And Hillary Clinton said, no, we need Muslim communities to collaborate with us, namely to come and tell us who is really the terrorist, so we can live in peace. Or question of gender became very important, obviously, for the first woman president. This, however, is extremely important for you to know that when Gloria Steinem, a typical bourgeois feminist figure, came and said that the only reason that women go to Bernie Sanders' campaign, I'm quoting almost verbatim, is because boys are there. And former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright also came and said, any woman who doesn't vote for Hillary Clinton has a special place in hell. Now, you have to be aware that the United States is also home to some exceptionally progressive feminists, Zila Eisenstein, Bell Hooks. They were coming out and say against this kind of nonsensical bourgeois feminism. And Kimberly Crenshaw, my own colleague, has the theory of intersectionality, that race, gender, and class have to come together in order to constitute the politics for a potential voter, was also there. But what Mark Leyla was now here doing, it was talking against identity liberalism, because Clinton, he thought, was catering too much to identity liberalism. A couple of days after that, my other Columbia colleague, Catherine Franke, wrote a response to Mark Leyla, published it in Los Angeles. And in that response, you will see the real tension that now exists about identity politics and the question of white supremacy. This is what Catherine Franke said. Last Friday, this is the opening paragraph, 2 tweets were posted to my feed within minutes of each other. David Duke tweeted, that's the head of the, one of the most famous KKK who ran for the Senate. Bannon, that's Steve Bannon, who is the head of the so-called alt-right, alternative right, and also the publisher of a website called Breitbart, which is notorious for its Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, etc. Things. Flynn, who is now designated to become the next national security advisor, and Session, great. Senate must demand, this is David Duke, that Sessions as AG, Attorney General, stop the massive institutional racism against whites. This is Catherine Franke citing David Duke. Yes, I follow David Duke. She says on Twitter, I now follow many right-wing sites. I learn more from them than I do from the echo chamber of Facebook. And the New York Times, now she continues, tweeted out Mark Leyla's opinion piece, which I just quoted from it, The End of Identity Liberalism. In the new political climate we now inhabit, Catherine Franke says, Duke and Leyla, she's equating a KKK and a professor at Columbia, were contributing to the same ideological project. Both men are underwriting the whitening of American nationalism and the recentering of white lives as lives that matter most in the US. Duke is happy to own the white supremacy of his statements, while Leyla's op-ed does the more nefarious background work of marking white supremacy respectable again. Mark Leyla and I both teach at Columbia University, and I acknowledge that this is a harsh indictment of my colleague, but these are harsh times. Leyla's op-ed makes an argument for the commonalities between Americans, arguing that we have to move on the post-identity liberalism, refocusing our attention away from the identities to broader, more abstract ideas of citizenship. The rest of the article, which again I recommend for you to read, argues that what Mark Leyla is saying, let's get beyond identity politics, is actually white identity above all, über alles, but doesn't talk about other identities, wants to talk about your identity. Your identity becomes the definition, and others have to abide by it. Now, the issue that my kind of thinking has with this debate on identity politics is as follows. As those of you who are perhaps familiar with my work, you know, I'm not that much into identity. I'm into alterity. I think the issue that we face today